Hi, this is Aaron J. Waltke, co-executive producer of Star Trek Prodigy, and you're listening to the FSF Popcast.
Hello, guys, and welcome to the FSF Podcast. I'm Tim. I am your host, and want to remind you that the FSF Podcast is the show made by nerds for nerds, and we are so proud to have a fellow nerd here with us today. Our guest today is an Emmy-winning and Annie Award-nominated screenwriter, producer, and showrunner. Now, you're going to know him best for his works on shows like Wizards, Troll Hunters, Tales of Arcadia, Unikitty, and of course, Star Trek Prodigy, which has just launched season 2 over on Netflix. We are very excited, pleased as punch, you could say, to welcome Aaron J. Waltke to the FSF Podcast. Welcome to the show, Aaron.
Hey, my absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me. Live long and prosper and all that.
I said so. I was going back through season 1 today and watching some of the episodes on season 1.
Yeah,
and I at the spot in episode 13 where it's called All the World's a Stage. live long and prosper. Live long and proper. Yeah, that was it.
Yeah, I have to catch myself now because, I wrote that episode and a lot of people come up to me and say they love that episode and they do the live long and proper to me, which is like,
right.
The incorrect version
inverse,
that these that these Enterprisians on this planet have sort of accidentally sort of co-opted from the logs that they had read about Starfleet and introduced it into their society. Yes, but now whenever I say live long and prosper, my brain does it wrong from that episode.
Yeah, I had forgotten in that episode that's what they had done, and I was watching it, and it was one of those things where like you kind of your head snaps up and go, did they just say, oh yeah, that's right?
Yes. Yeah, the whole thing was, among other things, sort of I love Mad Max, and there's
right.
a really amazing sequence in Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome where it tells the backstory, but through generations of children who have kind of heard the tale of the apocalypse, which they now call the Apoxyclips and all that, and the long ago. And so that was kind of tattooed on my brain when I was writing that episode.
That's very cool. So, yeah, that's actually a really cool backstory. So one of the things when I always have somebody on the show, Aaron, is I have them on because there's a particular reason. I've liked something that they've done. I wanted to talk to them about something. And one of the reasons I wanted to have you on the show is that, so before I sat down and watched Star Trek Prodigy, I was not very much of a Star Trek fan.
Interesting.
So Star Trek Prodigy was kind of my gateway drug into Star Trek. And from there, I went to Strange New Worlds and got hooked on Strange New Worlds, and then went back and watched TOS, and I'm into TNG right now. And so there was a lot of things that I have started watching because of Star Trek Prodigy. So, yeah, I wanted to say
I want to say that's amazing to hear. That's absolutely what we designed the show to do, because as somebody who was kind of the opposite experience, like I grew up with Star Trek. Like one of my earliest memories, it was when I was like 3 or 4, sitting on the couch with my dad watching Next Generation live as it premiered way back in September of 1987. But I will be the first to admit that whenever people ask me, like, how do I get into Star Trek? Before Prodigy came along, there was not, or perhaps Strange New Worlds, there was not really an easy entry point. The answer was always, well, maybe just watch like 100 episodes of TNG and you'll kind of absorb it by osmosis. Like, which is how most Star Trek fans that I'm aware of kind of became inundated with it, because I'm always reminded, like, of Futurama has this really funny joke where somebody's like, says to Fry they'd never seen Star Trek. And it's like, what? The original series is brilliant. It's like 90 episodes and 30 good ones. But I mean, in a way it's true, because when you have literally 60 years of Star Trek, people remember the great stuff and they power through the mediocre stuff. And inevitably there's going to be a few swings and misses, but we Trekkies love it dearly because we think of it holistically. And all we wanted to do was with Star Trek Prodigy was take all of those things we love about the entire franchise that's now what 12 or 13 shows or something,
Right.
and
Yeah.
distill it down to its essence and lay it out in very clear sort of dynamics for outsiders looking in at the Federation to also be a proxy for audiences who might be curious, like what's the deal with transporters?
Hmm.
How does the Prime Directive work? What's first contact? And lay it out in a way that was entertaining, and breaks it down to its sort of key components, but also rebuilds it in a way that even adds new stuff for long-term Star Trek fans to get something out of. So it's very heartening to hear that our show worked as intended.
Yeah, no, it really did. And I think that for me, one of the things, there's a couple things that I appreciated about it. Number one was just what you said, that having been on the outside looking in, I didn't really ever understand what the Prime Directive was for Star Trek, and I found it to be very confusing. And
Well,
then
you and a lot of
it's
people.
I still find it to be confusing because I don't think there's a consistent answer out there
No.
as to what it is and what it isn't. But I do think that Prodigy did probably one of the better jobs of trying to explain what the Prime Directive was and how it should be implemented, and especially when you start talking about first contact with different civilizations and all these different things. I thought Prodigy did a really, really good job on that. And then the other thing that I appreciated was that it seemed to me that uh, there there was a sense of real stakes for the kids in the show, of life and loss, and it wasn't just, hey, here's some kids, having lots of fun doing Star Trek things, and they got phasers and teleporters, there's transports and all these different things. It seemed to me that there was real stakes there. So was that intentional to have those real stakes there as part of the storyline, or is that something that just kind of happened?
I think we always wanted to kind of push the sort of emotions of it all and the stakes of it as far as we could. Obviously there are things that modern viewers are very intelligent, right? And so you're
Hmm.
always kind of pushing up against expectations and assumptions, and in many ways you're competing with all media that has ever been produced in the last century, because
Right.
audiences are smart and they know, with the exception of like a Game of Thrones or The Boys or something, you're not going to kill a character. So that kind of
Right.
leaves like what is there to left for this character's wants and needs, and I think a lot of it comes down to emotional needs. And we talked a lot about in Star Trek Prodigy in particular. We had sort of a twofold mandate. One was exploring what what it means to what the Federation means to those without, the people who didn't grow up in that environment of safety and abundance, and sort of what they call a post scarcity society. And in keeping with that, we also talked a lot about sort of developmental psychology, because these are young people. And
Hmm.
one thing we talked about was and stop me if I get too nerdy with this, but the one thing we talked about was the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is a sort of a famous element
Right.
in psychology, developmental psychology, that essentially says that for someone to achieve self-actualization, to become their best self, they kind of need a pyramid of things, starting with as simple as like food and shelter, and then
Hmm.
working your way up to kind of like emotional acceptance and support, and then eventually they can kind of become their best selves. And we thought that mapped really interestingly onto ostensibly what Starfleet represents, because
Hmm.
it is in many ways the best of the best, but even all of these sort of trained officers are constantly trying to expand their minds and their perspectives, and improve themselves, and I think we just took it a couple steps backward and said, can you take these young people like unmolded clay, put them into this environment where they could thrive and watch them go? And we unequivocally said yes. I think anybody, if given the opportunity, deserves the chance to explore who they are and find a place where they belong. And both of those are exceptionally Star Trek concepts. And I think part of that too is like we didn't want it to be an easy path because it never is, even for some of us who are privileged to grow up in first world countries, quote
Sure.
unquote. I think there's always going to be struggles as you kind of come into contact with either conflict without or within, and we wanted to reflect that as sort of a real aspect while also maintaining that sort of slightly larger than life elements of hope and adventure that I think the best of Star Trek encapsulates.
Oh, that's a great answer. I think that one of the things that the show really does well is just that it helps show that you see the character build and the growth of each of the characters throughout the first season and into the second season. And especially when you look at like Dal and how he's grown from not trusting anybody to, being the captain by default because he named himself captain, and all these other things, and to actually getting to a spot where he cares about somebody else. And you see that with the rest of the cast too. It's just, it's an amazing, to me, one of the things I appreciate about it was that you have this kind of ragtag group that kind of each doing their own thing, formulating into an actual team, a unit. And then what I always take from Star Trek is there's the sense of hope. They went from not having hope to having hope, and they're showing that throughout the galaxy wherever they go.
Yeah, absolutely. Our supervising director and executive producer, Benny Ball, who's like an amazing artist in his own right. He was kind of a newcomer. Like he was aware of Star Trek, but we had to
Mhm.
kind of like onboard him with everything that was amazing about it. And he had this really astute observation as he learned more about the world of Trek, which was that some franchises like Star Wars is very much the
Mhm.
story of one. Luke is kind of the chosen one who will bring the balance of the Force. The Skywalkers are this lineage of
Mhm.
great ones who will kind of help rectify great evil. But Star Trek is the story of many.
Yes.
Obviously Spock famously encapsulates it with the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. But I think to expand on that, Star Trek is about acknowledging that not anyone is perfect, but we can accomplish great things if we aspire to listen to our better angels and try to become something better. And to borrow from that old platitude, it really is about the journey, not the destination. That it's always seeking that next horizon and seeing what's out there.
Very cool. One of the things that you just mentioned when you were talking about some of the classic characters, you talked about, Spock. You can also think about, Kirk, Sulu, the original characters. You have the TNG characters, these people that really inspired a lot of what we see coming forward past that point. But Prodigy has made sure to tie into these classic Treks, I think, very well. We look at, with the use of Spock in season one, you have references to the season, the TOS characters rather in season one. You of course have Janeway from Voyager. You've got a lot of these different things. But now with season two, there's also a tie-in not only to TNG but also to Picard. And people are
Yeah.
noticing that there's a tie-in for Picard season three. Why is it important for you guys for this show to tie in so much to canon and inform the other shows?
Well, I mean, there's a few reasons for that. I think the biggest one for me, from just a purely like sort of lifelong fan, I always felt that what delighted me the most, among other things, about Star Trek, watching it as a fan in the '90s, was that it was interconnected. It was one big sort of grand tapestry that we were catching little sort of
Mhm.
spin-offs and chapters of in different parts of the four quadrants. Um, Obviously, in the '90s, I think they were somewhat restrained in how much they could go, but I think Berman and Braga and the whole team did an exceptional job of finding ways to slip it past the radar for the people that were paying attention and watching these episodes as if they were reading a book, to make it all feel interconnected. And nowhere do you see that more in like Deep Space Nine, where if the first episode starts with Voyager launching from Deep Space Nine, and but meeting Captain Picard, who because Captain Sisko lost his wife, I think in the battle of Best of Both Worlds, and so like it was all kind of hanging together in my mind. And I think especially once we kind of had taken our crew out of the Delta Quadrant and had them shoot right into the heart of the Federation and the Alpha Quadrant in season 2, canon is canon, as they say, and sure, there we could have cheated, I guess, and just said, oh, the whole story takes place over a few days and we're never going to get to 2385, and spoiler alert, all the stuff that happens in Picard. But we weren't really interested in that. If a major event happens, if anything, we saw that as new territory to see how, and ask ourselves, how would that affect our story, and how can our story in turn affect that? We always felt like there was more to be told with what we had seen in Picard. And thankfully, everyone we talked to, both on the Picard teams, Akiva Goldsman and Terry Metalis, and the folks at Secret Hideout and CBS, they all, once we laid out our plan of how we wanted this to sort of be like the next chapter in that anthology of what happens in the mid 2380s, all of them were very excited and completely on board. Obviously, we go to some serious places right there at the end, but people, that happens. That's life. Children are, you can shield children only for so long, and then at a certain point you have to start teaching them how they can process these heavy ideas or things that are happening in the world in a healthy way, so that they can become stronger people and perhaps help to make the world better in spite of it.
Oh, that's a great answer. I think that's always good, because now, growing up a Star Wars fan, for a lot of our shows on the other side of the column here, there was a lot of shows where there was a disconnect between this show and how this show had informed that show, and vice versa. And there's still that argument going on today with the new show. Hold on.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's always the, to get into the fandom of it all. I think we find ourselves now having, media from 120 years that people kind of grow up and embrace a certain thing that really is very meaningful, a story that impacts them or is very formative to their experience. And so I think the temptation or the desire to revisit those worlds is, paramount. I get it. Like I'm making a Star Trek show because I love Star Trek, but I think what we're starting to run into now is sometimes people have a memory, and it's very difficult to compete with a memory of how you felt, because it's never going to be the same. To get into sort of neuropsychology, anytime you remember something, you're actually remembering the last time that you remember it, and you change the memory every time you remember it, right? And
Correct.
So that, I think there are things that people remember as like this sort of an encapsulation of where they were in that place and time. And sometimes you find yourself competing against that when you're trying to introduce new chapters into that world, and it's always going to be a struggle. And I think it's going, this is not new, by the way. Like, art has always dealt with what comes before and how do you reinvent it.
Right.
Modernists were despised by the classicists. Postmodernists were despised by the modernists. But the point being, like, I think that the key is to never be disrespectful to those feelings that audiences have, but I think it is of paramount importance to also be willing to kind of expand your definition of what is possible, because otherwise stories will kind of calcify and will die because you're just recreating the same thing over and over again.
No, and I like that answer too, because I think what you said, like you said, it starts to calcify, it starts to die. And I think a lot of franchises suffer from tunnel vision, where this is the only path that this story can go. And it has to be right here, because if it's not in there, then they're afraid of what may or may not happen. But I like the fact that when I watch Star Trek, everything I've ever watched in Star Trek, I always see that there's something that shows the hope for mankind,
Sure.
and what we could be and what we might be if we can learn to play nice with each other. And the other thing that I appreciate is that from the outside looking in and I still consider myself a newbie when it comes to Star Trek, is
welcome.
that
All are welcome.
right. Yeah. I feel like there's not that disconnect where it's just that tunnel vision. I feel like there's opportunity for stories to go here and to go there, and that they yet somehow all kind of weave back into the central discourse and all connect. And I that's one of the things I very much have appreciated about Prodigy in particular.
Yeah, and I think that's something that Star Trek specifically, I could be wrong, but I think Star Trek and Doctor Who are kind of neck and neck for the longest running continuous science fiction universe that is ostensibly all the stories that took place happened and are all connected. And I think that willingness to kind of accept new stories in place of the old while maintaining that fundamental theme, that vibe of hopefulness, of curiosity and acceptance. I think as long as you kind of hit that sort of core in some regard, even if you want to expand on it or reinvent it, you have to acknowledge it. Then you'll have the opportunity to, to try new things. And in some ways, I think that's something Star Trek has over Star Wars, is that Star Wars for many, many, many years only had 3 movies and then the books and I guess the video games. Right. And so what they considered sort of canon was this sort of like, it has to be this. And now I think we're all in a position with Star Wars in particular where, we're going through those growing pains of kind of feeling our way through the dark of like, what else can Star Wars be, and I'm very curious to see what this period of time in fandom will look like 10 years out. I think it can be exciting and it can also be scary and it can also be contentious, but not to get philosophical, but as if we haven't already been philosophical, but but I think that in many ways that's what art is supposed to do, right? It's supposed to make you question things. You're supposed to feel bad sometimes and then question yourself why you're feeling bad. So
I agree.
I think and not all art is going to be perfect. It's not all going to be successful, but if we're talking about it, then it's doing something, right?
It's doing its job. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I one of the things I love is that after I watch this, as much as I love Star Wars, and that's what I grew up on, and that has always been like, bad day. Well, let's put on some Star Wars. It'll make the day better.
Listen, I was a Star Wars kid too. I grew up in Indianapolis. Yeah. I went to Star Wars Celebration. I met Peter Mayhew. It's great.
Yeah. But never once did I watch anything Star Wars, and after I got done with it, go, well, how does that affect humanity? There have been so many times when I've watched Star Trek rather, and I've gotten done with an episode and I've had to like not go into the next episode because I was sitting there pondering what I had just watched, how it affects me now, and how it affects humanity around me, and and even the hope for humanity moving forward. And so I think that's always, to me, has always been one of the good things about Star Trek and the fandom, and having and being able to have some of those conversations with other Star Trek fans and talking about those very same episodes and getting their point of view, their perspective, I think has for me has been a lot of fun. So
absolutely. And that's something I love about the Star Trek fandom. They have been some of the kindest, most embracing, sweetest people I have ever met.
Very much so.
For whatever reason, for the longest time, I never went to a Star Trek convention until I started working on this show, because I was like, oh, is it going to be my scene? I haven't really done cosplay or anything like that. And and then I showed up and it was like meeting hundreds of friends that I didn't know I had. because I think it engenders a certain sensibility, like, thoughtful and creative and welcoming and hopeful. And I love communities like that.
Yeah, it's a very cool thing to be in part of. But let's look back at the show here for a moment. Now, at the end of season 1, of course, there was a little disappointment that Nickelodeon did not carry this on. and there were people were worried about what the future of Prodigy was going to be. In comes Netflix and says,
Mhm.
"Yeah, come on over here and continue your show." Now, recently, I noticed that on Rotten Tomatoes, the show has 100% from critics, 95% from the fan base. How is that personally validating for you that this show needed to continue?
Um, le- I will say it's deeply humbling. You know, as a Midwesterner, I struggle to take compliments because I'm like, no, it's for you. you know,
Understood.
we
Yeah.
worked, but it is validating in that it means that, at least according to many folks, we didn't screw it up. Because if you can't tell, Star Trek means a great deal to me, and it does to a lot of the people that were on both seasons of the show, for all the reasons we've been elucidating on already. And to everybody on the crew, from the artists to the storyboard artists to the editors to the sound mixers to the directors, everybody, and the writers, everybody was doing their absolute darnest to try to live up to what they felt was the kind of like the very high bar that not just our show had set for ourselves, but what we knew Star Trek could be and should be again. And we all we wanted was to create an entry point, that would hopefully bring new folks like yourself into the Star Trek fandom, and also be exciting for those people to kind of see it all on display in a way that also added to the canon, I think, in a surprising and delightful way. And so I could never have dreamed the reaction that Star Trek season 2 was going to get. I think, in my heart of hearts, I was like, I know that I made some good Star Trek that I would like to watch. And to my utter shock, it is taking off in a way that I never, or I had hoped it would. But I think with all of the tumultuousness going on in the industry right now, you never
Mhm.
know.
Yeah.
Because it takes a very special kind of kismet for that word of mouth to spread, and have to finally kind of bring in the old guard who perhaps already have too much TV to watch, or they're like, oh, I'll get to it later. But now every day I wake up to hundreds of messages from people saying that they love the season. It's one of their favorite seasons of Star Trek ever made, which is like, be
Mhm.
still my heart. you know and it makes me very hopeful for the future of Star Trek in general, that we can still elicit that kind of response, in this very noisy world.
Yeah, it's very cool. Because so let me ask you this about your personal perspective on this, because now with Nickelodeon, it was released episodically, a week at a time. Netflix, it's ta-da, here it is. Is there a little bit more trepidation when it's all like shotgun release like that, or are you
I
afraid that people aren't going to get the whole gist of it?
I think there was some trepidation in just the fact that it had never been done before with Star Trek. Like, Star Trek
Sure.
had never tried that release before. July 1st now has the most Star Trek episodes that have ever been released on a single day because of our show. But interestingly enough, just as Star Trek is forward looking, I think we kind of held on to this belief that, in a strange way, that kind of disruptive kind of model that Netflix has embraced, would help us, and I think it has. I've been on, what they call focus group tests,
Hmm.
for various projects, and they show like the demos of like the 8 to 10, 10 to 12, boys, girls. And unilaterally, when you ask them how they watch television, all of them said, they either just watch YouTube for 6 hours, or they will import a whole season of anime and binge it all in like a day or a day and a half.
Yeah.
And then they'll spend months just, talking about it with their friends, making fan art, speculating on the next season. And that's how they consume media. Um,
Right.
but I grew up with the week to week model. I still love appointment viewing. It's wonderful. But I think, in a way, because of our show in the particular circumstances that it's in, I think it actually helped by for a lot of people that might be slightly skeptical or unsure if it's for them. They could have people who had seen the whole season say, "Don't worry, it's great," and and then breathe a sigh of relief that all those things that weren't explained in episode 3 or 4 are in fact setups for payoffs that come back, a few episodes later. And I think in the uncertainty in this day and age where there's so much television and you don't know if a show is going to continue or if it falls off or this or that, like people are afraid to invest their time in something that they don't know is going to be good. And so in a way, the fact that we had Star Trek fandom, being what it is, there are people that had watched it 3 or 4 times within like a day and a half, which is crazy to me, but I'm delighted. And they became the kind of vanguards lighting the pyre of Gondor, saying like, it's here, we did it, it's great,
Right.
go watch it. And that allowed more, 5 more people to say, okay, I'm going to start it tomorrow. And then those people are catching up and saying, wow, this is great. And so it is creating that snowball effect, which is exactly what we hoped for our show. So it was absolutely an experiment. There's no question. It's never been released this way. Well, It'll be curious to see how it does in the long run and how it affects other releases. But, for our series, I think it was to the good. And I'm so glad that so many people, young and old, are now. It's all there for them to watch. Waiting for them.
Yeah, because it's all over socials right now.
Yeah,
the hashtag Prodigy, Star Trek Prodigy. People are commenting about how much they love season 2 and how much they're looking forward to a possibility of a season 3. And is there anything that about that? How is that looking for us?
So the short answer is Netflix doesn't tell anything to anybody until they are ready to share that. So
Fair
basically, they have thankfully started to release data in chunks. I can't remember if it's every 6 months or a year, where they will talk about, like, I think it's 6 months, where they will reveal this is how many hours of this show have been watched globally. So we will get that information in a few months, no matter what. The question of like whether it meets their sort of algorithmic requirements is still very much in the air right now. It's only been out a week. And so they want to collect the data for the next few weeks, or maybe months, to see if it has a halo effect and if people are watching it all the way through to the end, or if they're watching it again, or if it's making them watch other shows. Like, all of this kind of are factors that are kind of beyond my comprehension.
Fair enough.
But if you viewers or listeners at home want to support the show, the best thing you can do is watch it beginning to end, hopefully by the end of the month, and spread the word, post about it, tell a friend, and if you like Star Trek, and say, hey, this is a really good season of Star Trek, you should watch it, we could still get more.
There you go. All right. Well, good. That's a good call to action for our listeners, so they know where they can do and what they can do. So watching it on Netflix is where you need to be, guys and gals. Give it the old thumbs up there. Okay. Now, you mentioned this a couple minutes ago, and so I'm just going to circle back to it, because you talked about whenever I have somebody on who has done something in what I call the big 5 IPs. That's Star Wars, Star Trek, Marvel, DC, or Lord of the Rings. Those are my big 5.
Sure.
I always want to know what it means to them personally to be part of that world. They've been a fan of it for a long time, but now here they are, they're working in it. So in the case of Aaron J. Waltke, what does it mean to him personally to have been a part of Star Trek and have a part in the storytelling of it?
I mean, it means the world to me. It means the galaxy to me. I think the kind of one of the unique aspects, or certainly the hallmark aspects of Star Trek in particular, is that it's not necessarily something that takes place in a far off land or in a fake world. By all intents, it is acting as if this is our future right now. And in that way, I think it engenders a sort of call to action in its own right of, we can rise above what's happening now. There is a possibility to create a better future for everyone if we want it. And, in a way, that kind of moral obligation of like, why do we create art? ostensibly it's to alleviate other people's pain or to encourage them to see things from a different perspective or to feel things, as sort of catharsis, as the Greeks would say. Um, and I think it's a lot more concrete with Star Trek. It's to inspire us to do better now as humans, and the chance to contribute to that, I think, sort of call to arms in a way, and in some small way inspire other people to have those aspirations as well. That means everything to me. Like that's that's all anyone can hope to do with the work they do on this planet.
I love it. Excellent. All right, I have one question for you from a good friend of ours. She's a fellow podcaster. Her name is Jessie, and she runs a great Trek themed podcast called Crusher Convo. Now, she's a big fan of big fan of Beverly Crusher and Beverly's Boys. And now in season 2, I think it's 8 appearances by Mr. Will Wheaton.
That sounds about right. Yeah.
Yeah. I think he's in 8 different episodes. But so Jesse wanted to know, what was the important aspect of Wesley's character that you really wanted to highlight with season 2?
Well, there's a few reasons why we wanted to bring Wesley back specifically. One, as a selfish fan, like I think I always had that sort of dangling question in my head of like, where did he go and what's he been up to?
Sure. Sure.
And as a TNG fan, I was sad that he just 3 episodes before the end kind of decided Starfleet wasn't for him, and then just kind of vanished into the ether. Partially because so much of that arc with the Traveler in particular was saying you are being prepared for a grand destiny that I cannot reveal now, but will be revealed someday. And that became this big question mark floating in the back of my psyche for the past 30 years of what else is out there, and what's Wesley been up to with that agency. Thankfully, a number of the other writers in the room, like Jen Murrow, felt the same way. So as soon as she brought that up as like, who would guide these young people through this sort of timey-wimey paradox, and be relatable to them, like, but almost at the same time, we both were like, Wesley Crusher, because he, as we know, was the original Prodigy in Star Trek, The Next Generation. And in a way, he could function both as a cautionary tale, but also as a mentor and a role model of like the do's and don'ts of how to kind of fulfill your potential in a way that is meaningful and impactful to others. I think on top of that, on a more meta level, we, going back to the introducing new and young audiences to the greater Star Trek universe, we never intended our show to only be a Voyager sequel. We just wanted we use a lot of Voyager because we had Catherine Janeway as a character, and we wanted to honor that and not just kind of, her be a toy that we take out of the box and put it in. The relationships that she has are obviously Voyager related, but I think this was an opportunity to expand that purview even further and show like how broad and sweeping the Star Trek universe truly is. On top of that, I think what I do sympathize in some ways with how Wesley, has grown up into somebody who has to try to hold everything in his head just to try to keep it together, as somebody who, is on the sort of the upper level of the executive producer side. I do find sometimes it does come down to just one person, just trying to hold their little sphere together and encourage everybody else to to do what they need to keep the show going. So I definitely empathized with Wesley, and I definitely felt as scatterbrained sometimes as he was, trying to hold the multiverse together by himself, while also and on top of that, for his character, we were like, we don't want Wesley to just be a cameo that is completely unaffected by the events of our show. If he's going to be part of the story, it's going to be his story too. And we thought it was very interesting with him that he is somebody who has done so much to try to help other people and protect the people from his past life, that he himself has been so busy he's forgotten how to live, and what better way to kind of rectify that or bring closure to his storyline than to have his interactions with our crew and with Admiral Janeway on this adventure, to kind of remind him that the people that you're fighting for are as much a part of your life as they are sort of an abstract, sort of noble thing you're doing. And so him going, who better to kind of close that loop emotionally with than reconnecting with his family, the Crushers. And I think, we worked with Picard certainly to try to accommodate that. And once they heard that we were using Wesley, they had an idea, because they were using like supervisors and kind of hinting at the travelers in especially Picard season 2. And they were like, look, we wanted a traveler to come, and it would feel weird if it was just a random person. Is there a way we can make this like set up your show?
Yeah.
And sure enough, they were kind enough to, I kind of laid out the whole mythology of like, okay, if they're tied to the supervisors, here's where Wesley is, here's who he has in your show.
Right.
They even let me kind of do some revisions on his scene to conform to that. And Akiva and Terry were both extremely collaborative and excited to kind of weave this greater kind of tapestry between our two shows. Two shows. Yeah.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. That's awesome. And I love the fact that Wesley wasn't just a side thought or just a splash in cameo, and that he was an integral part. And I think that's a really a cool nod to both TNG and Picard and where the show can go in the future. So kudos to you guys for doing that well. And Jesse, I hope that answers your question, because I thought it did. Really good answer.
I think I might be on her podcast soon, so we can go into depth.
Oh, fantastic. All right. Yeah, no, she's great. I've been a big fan of Jessie and the Crusher Convo for quite a while. She's a good friend of the show, and she's been very helpful for me when I have Trek questions going. There's been many times where I have texted her, what the hell did I just watch? Can you break this down for me like I'm 5? Break out the crayons.
But you have to understand, in Trekkie communities, that's like our national sport. Like that's all we do is just answer questions for each other. And if something doesn't make sense, we talk about it ad nauseum until we've satisfactorily come up with 3 hypotheses that knit it together.
I'm good with that. I like that.
Yeah.
Okay, Aaron, I have one final question for you. We call this our silly question. Now, it can be as serious or as silly as you like. And we started asking this question of our guests because, well, my co-host Kathleen has a 5-year-old daughter. And one day this question was asked of her daughter, but they did not ask Kathleen. And Kathleen was like, well, that's kind of rude. So, Aaron J. Waltke, what's your favorite dinosaur?
Oh, gosh, my favorite dinosaur. That's actually complicated. I've always been a fan of Diplodocus was a great one. Deinonychus. I know they're not a dinosaur, they're a pterosaur, but Archaeopteryx was always a big fan of, and Quetzalcoatl. There's so many good ones. Come on. Styracosaurus, I think, was my favorite as a child, because they're like, it's like a Triceratops, but more.
Right. Okay. Excellent. Yeah, I'm a Triceratops fan. That was always my favorite. So
yeah. I liked stegosaurs too, just because they have, they have armor plating, and they have what I think they're called thagomizers on the back, the little spikes on their tail. Which fun fact, that was named in a Far Side cartoon. If you remember that old newspaper cartoon.
Oh yeah, yeah.
So there was a Far Side cartoon where it was cavemen studying. Or it was archaeologists or anthropologists or somebody or paleontologists studying the spike at the end of a stegosaur's tail, and they showed like a dead caveman skeleton on it, and it said, we don't know what this is called, so we just called it the thagomizer. Poor Thag, like the Apparently paleontologists is like, oh, we don't actually have a name for that. Let's just call it the Thagomizer.
And so then known as the Thagomizer. Love it.
Yeah.
That's
Anyway,
fantastic. No, that's great. I love it. Little trivia tidbit. All right, Aaron, thank you so much for being on the FSF podcast today. Where can our listeners and viewers go to find out more about you and possibly what you have coming up?
Sure. So you can find me on pretty much all social media, Instagram, the app formerly known as X, Blue Sky, at Good Aaron. That's GOODAARON. And I will always keep you updated on any news about Star Trek Prodigy or future projects that I have. Sometimes I'll drop little tidbits of trivia about the shows and projects I'm working on. You can also follow the other writers on Star Trek Prodigy. We also have a writers room Twitter that's called at Trek Prodigy Room, and they'll retweet all kinds of fan art and cool. Boost any news about the show. So check us out, and I'll keep you updated.
Very cool. I'll make sure that we put those down in the show notes down below so people can have an opportunity to follow you and the writers room both out on socials. So awesome. And guys, this is a perfect time to remind you that now is a good opportunity, if you haven't already, to click that subscribe button down below. It helps our show continue to grow, get amazing guests like Aaron Waltke to join us and have these conversations where you get funny moments to listen to. You get some random trivia facts, and you get to hear some cool behind the scenes stories. So yeah, please subscribe. It helps us more than we can ever really tell you. And be sure to go check out Aaron and the writers room as well over on the socials. So again, Aaron, thank you for being on the FSF podcast. Really appreciate it today, bud.
Hey, it was absolutely my pleasure. Peace and long life. And go check out Star Trek Prodigy on Netflix, available right now. 40 episodes, 2 seasons. You won't regret it.
Live long and proper. All right, guys. On behalf of the FSF podcast, goodbye.
Copyright 2024 FSF Podcast. Reference to any specific product or entity mentioned on this podcast does not constitute an endorsement or recommendation by FSF Podcast. The views expressed by guests are their own, and their appearance on the program does not imply an endorsement of them or any entity they represent. If you have any questions about this disclaimer, please contact us via email at info@fsfpodcast.com.